Welcome to everybody, and thanks for joining us today. On the 6th of May last year, a gas explosion occurred underground at Grosvenor mine in Queensland, which resulted in 5 workers sustaining life-altering injuries. And within a week of that, the Minister had announced a board of inquiry, and that report is in, has been for some time. And Sean and I are going to attempt to take our key findings today. So I'm Jodi Goodall. I'm the head of Organisational Reliability for Brady Hayward, and my co-host is Dr. Sean Brady, the Managing Director of Brady Hayward. So in terms of what you can expect from this session, up front, I just want to say that our focus is really about learning and not about blame. And we're certainly not coal experts, so you're not going to get a big technical review from us today. Our focus is really on the organisational causes. And so that's what we're going to centre our discussion around. And obviously, we've only got 45 minutes plus 15 minutes at the end for questions. So it's a few key takeaways that we think are the most important. So before I hand over to Sean, I just want to give a content warning. Real life accidents can be really distressing to experience. And I've got to say, even reading through these pages, a little piece of that incident, you know, I'm feeling for the people who are involved, their workmates and the leaders and their families. So with that, I'll hand over to Sean to talk about the event.
Thanks, Jodi. So the event happened on the 6th of May, as Jodi says. There were 5 workers in the longwall at Grosvenor. One of them, and this is from Wayne Sellers. Wayne Sellers gave testimony at the Board of Inquiry, and he said there was no warning for what he describes as the first pressure wave. The cutter wasn't cutting, it was pretty quiet. And then there was a pressure wave, huge burst of air. He said it was like standing in the middle of a cyclone. That lasted a few seconds and then it was over. The air was silent. The air was still at that point. It was silent. Ventilation had stopped. He turned to a co-worker and said, "They're not going to like this. There's another HPI." And then there came the second pressure wave. And this came about 10 seconds after the first. This one ignited, and Wayne Sellers describes it as seeing a blue flame, and he said it was like standing in a blowtorch. He, along with the others, were burned, and he said with that second pressure wave, there was a noise like 2 stones being cracked together. At that point, he was on fire, and he doesn't recall anything more about that second pressure wave. Wayne Sellers and the other injured workers made their way to the main gate. Then they were put in a vehicle and they took 30 minutes to get out of the mine, and then they were transported by ambulance to Moranbah Hospital. Just staying with Mr. Sellers, he suffered 70% burns to his body and has suffered multiple operations and been through multiple operations since then. So this was an incredibly serious accident. We'll talk about, in very short technical terms, in a little while about what happened. But as Jodi said, this led directly to the Board of Inquiry.
Thanks, Sean. So yeah, just really quickly around the Board of Inquiry. It happened pretty quickly. It was within 3 weeks. It started post Grosvenor explosion. And, you know, the board was asked to do a couple of things. They were asked to inquire into the nature and cause of the Grosvenor explosion, but also the 40 other methane exceedance high potential incidents that were happening around that time or over the 11 months prior. So the board looked into 4 particular mines. They looked into Anglo Grosvenor, Anglo Grasstree, Anglo Moranbah North, and also Glencore Oakey North mine. So they were after a couple of things. They were asked to assess and determine whether the operational practices and management systems that were in existence at the time were compliant with the relevant safety laws, but they were also asked to make recommendations that would prevent the same recurrence happening in the industry. So they ended up having to break their report up into 2 parts. The first part was everything except Grosvenor, and the reason for that was because mine inspector was running an investigation. They couldn't run a parallel investigation. But that first part is really, I think, really important. It's got all of the corporate governance stuff in it, which is the organisational pieces. And it also is a fantastic detailed account of the potential risk of methane exceedance, which I just found very helpful, and a fantastic explanation. Part 2 is about the HPIs that occurred at Grosvenor and the serious accident. It's also got stuff about the labour hire arrangements and the functions of industry, health and safety reps. We're not going to talk too much about that today. One thing that is important is the Board of Inquiry didn't perhaps get to go as far as they would have liked. So the board was informed fairly early that many of the witnesses that they were intended to call with respect to the Grosvenor piece wouldn't be able, or would probably refuse to answer questions if they were compelled, because it would incriminate them, which is right and correct. And that that group was Anglo executives, Grosvenor mine management, and employees. And the board tried to get a legislation change that didn't come off, and so a lot of those people didn't get to tell their story. And I think this is really interesting, and perhaps it's the first learning from the session, because it's actually a larger scale of the same problem that workers run into during site investigations. It's really difficult for them to participate fully if they feel that there might be some sort of adverse punishment or something at the end. So the first message really is that you can blame or learn, but you can't usually have both. So the board did get to review a heap of statements, extracts from interviews, and they've come up with quite a good report, but you might be left wanting for deeper insights into the Anglo culture. I know I was.
So let's, before we jump into the details, we sort of have to do a crash course. So as you probably guessed, me and Jodi are trying to aim for a discussion here rather than the presentation, so that we'll make it a little bit more engaging. But before we get into what we think is interesting from the organizational side of things, it's worthwhile sort of getting our head around coal mining and methane, because I'm sure everyone on the webinar isn't very, it isn't over all of that. So I'm going to do literally a 2-minute introduction to coal and methane. If you're involved in the coal industry, this is going to be stupidly simplistic, and you're probably going to be shouting at your screen. But I think it's important, if you're not in the coal industry, to get your head around a couple of these concepts, because they come up and feed into the organizational stuff later on. So when you're mining coal, you've got methane to cope with, because you're inside coal and you're near other seams of coal. The problem with methane is it can be explosive. So if it gets above between 5 and 15% of oxygen, you can get a situation where you can have an explosive range. So the explosive range is somewhere in there. So you obviously don't want that inside an underground coal mine. There are a number of ways you can go about trying to cope with this methane. Drainage is one of them. So you can actually get in and take away the methane. There's drainage and post-drainage. Pre-drainage is when you actually drill into that methane, get the gas out before you mine it. Post-drainage typically occurs after, so you've already mined it, you're moving forward along what's called the long wall, just digging out the coal. The long wall is collapsing behind you into what's called the gulf, and you can end up with methane inside that gulf, and post-drainage is all about getting the methane out of the gulf. So drainage is about getting it out of the system. Next up is ventilation. So if you are, you're never going to get it all out of the system, so you're still going to be releasing methane as you're actually mining. So how do you cope with that? Well, you cope with that with a ventilation system. So you ensure that you've got a ventilation system that's got enough capacity that can dilute down that methane level back to below 5%. The other things that matter here is the speed of mining. So obviously the quicker you mine, the more methane you're going to release that's actually in the coal. There's a little more to it than that. You can actually have leakage, and this comes into the Grosvenor story quite a bit. You can have leakage of methane from other seams come in. So it's not just about the speed of mining, even though it's really, really important. So think about it this way. This is the way I tend to think about it. You got a system with so much gas in it. You can either take it out before or after, or you can manage what you've got there at the time. And one of the key levers you can turn up and down is your speed of mining when you're doing it. The other thing you need for a methane explosion is some form of an ignition source. And mines spend a lot of time making sure that things don't get too hot, they don't have sparks, that they don't have electrical problems down there to set off a methane explosion. There's other things you need to worry about as well, which is like spontaneous combustion of coal, which I'm not proposing to get into the details on now, but we will talk a little bit about later. So you've got your gas management, you've got your ignition protection. So that's really that 2-minute intro to how all this stuff works.
And probably if I can add to that, Sean, so what the regulator does is they put a safety factor of half on that, and they say that at 2.5% you have to, if you have an exceedance, that's called an exceedance, and that's when your gas content has gotten too high and you are having a high potential incident. So you have to report that through to the regulator. And really interestingly, something that came out of that for me was that Queensland has the least conservative gas exceedance numbers in actually nearly the whole world. So, New South Wales is much less, and China, lots of the other countries are much less as well. So I found that really interesting. The other thing that I probably would like to say there is methane explosions are more common than you think. So, 2010 in Pike River, 29 men were killed in a gas explosion. There's been a couple of explosions at Mara, one in 94, 11 men killed. That was a spontaneous combustion event with a secondary explosion. And there was also a really big gas explosion fire that didn't kill anyone, but there were 55 men at risk at Blakefield South. So there are a number of others. Another one at Mara, Appin, where 14 men, and Box Flat, Ipswich. So it's not the rare event that you think it is. And obviously we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go along.
And it's probably worthwhile just tying together the what you're saying, Jodi, about the HPIs and why the regulator is interested in the HPIs. That exceedance at 2.5%. That's essentially there because you start to get towards 5%. This is a way of saying, well, is there a problem in the mine? Because the way to think about it is, as I said, you got a system that's trying to manage the gas, and getting a HPI, getting an exceedance at 2.5% is an early warning sign that perhaps your gas management, could be the ventilation, could be the pre-drainage, could be the post-drainage, something ain't quite right in your system. So it's a really valuable warning sign to tell you could have a problem. That's the reason why the regulator collects that sort of information and looks at it.
It's probably worth just digging into the what was happening in the industry at in the lead up, Sean.
Yep.
So, part one, as I said, talks a lot about the HPIs in the industry. So, during 2018, Grosvenor were actually 60% of all of the methane HPIs that were happening in Queensland mining. So they had 32 on one of the longwalls they were mining, and that was by halfway through the year. In comparison to the rest of the industry that had 21, so 60% there.
And it's worthwhile saying that before that, in 2017, in Longwall 101, the regulator discovered that there was gas exceedances taking place that actually weren't being reported through to the regulator. So there was a much more concerted effort at that point to make sure, or the regulator was making sure that they were getting all the gas exceedances coming out of Grosvenor. So that 32 is a big number for once they moved on to Longwall 2. And we're going to talk about Longwall 3 and 4 because Longwall 4 is ultimately where the incident happened.
The other thing to note there is there was, there were investigations done on nearly every single one of those HPIs that were looked at in the board, and they came up with really consistent systemic failures. So it was always a combined ventilation, gas drainage. That seemed to be the main problem, not delivering basically the desired outcome in terms of being able to keep the methane concentration below. So that was really consistent throughout.
And the quality of those investigations were really good as well. So that was one thing that the board picked up, that they were, they used the words that it was a frank acknowledgement of the contributing factors. So the investigations of these HPIs, which were happening in the company for the purposes of the fact that this was a HPI reported to the regulator, they were getting to the bottom of the issues, and they were addressing the systemic issue here as well.
Right.
Which is the system not working essentially as well as it should have been. Do you want to talk about just how many were coming in Longwall 4, Jodi, at that point? How many methane exceedances were you getting?
Yes, right, let me see where I've got that. So in the few weeks that Longwall 104 was up and running, they'd had 14 methane exceedances. And in comparison to the whole time Longwall 103 was running, that it had 13. So they'd already surpassed, just in the couple of weeks that it was running, I think it was 10 weeks, they were already up to 14 methane exceedances. So, they were coming thick and fast at them.
Yeah, and they were getting, so like 3 of them were on one day, or 4 of them were on one day. Some of them were on consecutive days. So these HPIs were happening very, very, very quickly after one another. And the board says, they already had a lot of trouble with Longwall 103 before they got to Longwall 104, and they were saying, that by Longwall 104, that was at least 65% greater than Longwall 103 when it comes to daily average gas make. So that they had lots of problems on 103, but now were having massive problems on Longwall 4 in terms of managing this gas and keeping the system functioning the way it was meant to function.
So let's jump into the organisational learnings then, Sean.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about when we're putting this presentation together is that it is really, really hard to get your head around all the recommendations. There's a lot of stuff going on in here. There's a lot of findings going on in here. It is more difficult because it's split across those 2 reports. I found it a lot easier actually when I started to look at the specific findings in part 2 relating to Grosvenor, and then keep going back to the industry stuff in part 1. So what myself and Jodi did was we sat down and said, right, well, what is the learnings here for the industry, regardless of whether you're in coal or not? If you're in, because what we see is the same sort of trends coming through here, the same sort of learnings as we do in a lot of organizational failures. So we sat down and we said, well, what are the key learnings that sort of jump out from an organizational perspective? The 2 of them we came up with, one of them was goal conflict, and we'll talk about that. And the other is a typical thing that me and Jodi talk about all the time, which is warning signs of failure. But let's jump into, goal conflict here. And there's really 2 pieces of goal conflict that really, we focused on and found ourselves focusing on. And that is, the old, conversation about production and safety, or production versus safety, or whatever way you want to call it. The same tension that most organizations have to try and deal with on a daily basis. And the other is the concept of plans and how plans can drift. So we'll come to that in a moment, but we'll start with production versus safety first. And I think, one of the most interesting things for me here is that so often it's very hard to find, well, how does production and safety relate? And we collect metrics and we do lots of stuff with metrics and see, can we put metrics together? But what the board were able to do was they were able to show that there was some very serious links between production rate, the rate at which they were cutting the coal, and the number of HPIs they were getting. So on weeks where they would have really high levels of tonnage coming out of the longwall, there were the weeks that they were getting the highest number of HPIs. Now, and I think this is where it starts to get really interesting. So you say, right, well, we're getting loads of HPIs associated with high production. What we're actually saying is you're getting loads of warning signs that tell you that your system, which is meant to be managing the methane in the mine, is not working as well as it should. And the board actually say, quote, producing coal at a rate that consistently exceeds the capacity of the critical control of gas drainage subjects coal mine workers to an unacceptable level of risk. And that's what the board concluded throughout that whole period of time, that this was a system that wasn't working as well as people want, and it wasn't giving the people who were working within it the protection that they needed.
And I think, Sean, everybody was really aware of that fact, that they could use production as a lever to manage the amount of gas that was coming out. So there's a really good quote from the chief executive of Anglo who says, and he was referring more than once to the relationship between production rate and safety. And he says, we consciously made a decision to drop them, Grosvenor, to a budget target of 100,000 tonnes a week. What we didn't want is the mine to be pushing themselves over and above the capacity, either for strata management or for gas management. Both of those things were an issue. So it was a decision we made to derate the production levels and the expectations to manage safety.
And, the board says, that, that there was a clear awareness of the relationship between production rates and safety, and that decision to reduce that budget was a safety related decision to you cut the production, you're going to cut the number of HPIs, you're going to cut the number of gas exceedances that are actually happening in the mine. So there was a decision made to reduce the budget, but what actually happened?
They actually continued to produce over and above, and as you said, there was really clear links on the days that they produced were the days that they had HPIs. Actually, every HPI, gas exceedance, was linked to a production that was over that, a daily production that was over that target.
Yeah. And the board go and say, with respect to the CEO's testimony, that he gave further evidence that his expectation was that senior management would reduce production rates where necessary so as not to exceed the capacity of its gas drainage system. So very specific reference to what was failing in the system. It was the gas drainage, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, that was actually failing. They weren't the post drainage, they weren't getting the gas out of it quick enough. And then the board goes on to say, contrary to Mr. Mitchell's declared expectation, this did not occur. And as Jodi says, you just have days of very high production. And this then starts to come down to the difference between a budget and a limit.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, as a senior leader, I think the message is you have to be, if you really want to help your business manage a risk, especially when it's in conflict with production, you have to be really clear on exactly what you're asking, and need to set limits. And even setting those larger targets weekly with so many delays that were happening, and so the mine was stopping and starting, and so they were in this situation where even to make the 100,000, they would have to, some days they produce 28,000 tonnes in a day, and so they're the days that correlated with HPIs. So yeah, I think the message is be really specific about and if you want to help your people on your sites to manage that, set the expectation very clearly about what you're after.
Yeah, because the board made the point that there was a budget reduction, but it wasn't a limit or a cap on production. And the site continued production. And the board doesn't deal with, and this is where I think Jodi goes back to the point you made earlier, that the board didn't get to probably dig as deep as they'd like to. We don't really know what was happening that was driving this at the time. But as Jodi says, I think the clear lesson, the clear takeaway is that if you want to really be careful to separate production and safety, you've got to be very explicit in how you do it, because people's natural drive is for production. That's what we do. So that's the first of the sort of goal conflict things we want to talk about. The second one is plan drift. This is something Jodi talks about a lot, and I think it's a really important concept that we see happening here in not even just in Grosvenor, but I think probably in the industry.
Yeah, it's fair to say that when you're trying to manage major hazards, the best way to do that is to physically design them out before you put the people in there to do the work. And so the pre-planning phase is really, really critical to to be able to give your people the best chance to be able to manage the leftover risk. And in Grosvenor's case, they had these two big hazards that they needed to manage. obviously the adjacent coal seams and the gas make, but also the difficult strata that they were coming into, and that was the situation they were kind of left with on the day. So the plan started off, as you said before, there's pre-drainage and post-drainage. The plan started off with a whole heap of pre-drainage. They were able to do that in the seam that they were mining, but not for some of the other seams. And as they went along, so they could have, but the estimations, all of those things told them that they probably didn't need to worry about it as much. Then then that was the pre-drainage. Then they moved into post-drainage, and a lot of that failed and was abandoned. So there were a number of strategies along the line that meant that they couldn't do post-drainage, especially of the adjacent wells. And so you can kind of see this thing happening where there's Grosvenor's almost this frog in a boiling pot. It's getting hotter, it's getting harder, it's getting gassier, and the site is managing this risk more at a day-to-day level. Let me just give you a couple of there's a couple of emails that really I think sum it up, from the SSE to the site senior staff in the days before. So he talks about the methane levels in the tailgate being bordering unmanageable and causing huge issues with constant delays, and that's starting to concern me, particularly as this fault system moves closer to the tailgate roadway, and in turn increasing the risk profile. So, there's the language there is definitely, it's bordering on unmanageable. It's not unmanageable yet. And then as the days went on, so this is the 6 days prior, he proposed a short-term proposal to increase the total gas extraction to vent it into the atmosphere. And so that is obviously not something that they would normally do, because it's got the potential to attract penalties for greenhouse gas emissions. So, then the next morning, I've given direction this morning that we need to act with urgency immediately on increasing the GoFix drainage extraction to allow us to keep cutting. This is an absolute must. So keeping cutting, keeping production going. And then in the couple of days before, they make the decision to inject polyurethane resin, which turns out to be a key factor in the ignition of the explosion, into a couple of, to create some stability in the strata. Yeah, so I think what you see there is you've got as each of the layers of defences start to break down, you get closer and closer. You're eroding your safety margin and drifting from where you really thought that that you were managing the hazard to really it being left on the day to manage.
And I think it's when you pull back from it, isn't it? It's like there was a plan, and there was a plan in place to make this happen, and there was a plan for, again, go back to this concept of the system for managing gas. There was a plan for the system, and the board really sum it up. They say when emissions at the workings at Longwall 104 soon proved to be much greater than the predictions, Grosvenor was caught short. Just the clarity of that language, it was caught short. The plan wasn't working as well as it should, not having sufficient post-drainage capacity for its targeted production. And there was obviously still a focus on production. You can see that in the emails. So then suddenly it's you're trying to manage these emissions that were not part of the plan. And I think one of the key takeaways we would have from this is, we all plan in all our industries, particularly in our high hazard industries. And the thing is, the plan is always put together and then given to people to execute. But when you're in that plan, when you're executing that plan at the time, when you see all that, just the erosion of that plan around you, it's not always easy to be able to step above it and say, actually, this plan is a real problem. And you see in some of the correspondence, they actually say, maybe we need to rethink how this long wall is going to actually work. Those discussions don't come to fruition, but that starts to enter into the correspondence of the plan. So I think our takeaway for this is, if you're putting your plans in place, you as a senior leader have to watch really, really carefully when those plans are in trouble, because your people probably won't notice it because they'll be too busy in it trying to manage the day-to-day of keeping that plan on the rails.
Actually, Sean, I don't want to skip over that. That's a really good point. The commercial manager, who's part of the senior leadership team, do you have that quote? He said that Moranbah North weren't running at the time, and so they had this big stockpile anyway at Grosvenor, and probably could have done with running for 12 hours on and 12 hours off, which would have helped manage the gas. Well, the board says it would have.
Yeah, so I got the quote here. So he says, so the question is, this is his quote. So the quote I think it was in let me just check. Is it in an email? Yeah, this was in an email. So the question is, do we fundamentally need to change the way we operate this long wall? So they're asking the question, for example, why might we be better off just cutting 12 hours solid on night shift, then stop and aggressively draw gas for 12 hours on day shifts? Or do we agree just to retreat 10 shears, then cut and aggressively draw? This long wall has demonstrated it can cut well, so perhaps it's our time management that needs to be revisited. So that's back to the speed of cutting and all those sorts of things. So there was a lot of conversations about how to manage this issue taking place as they tried to keep it all to the plan.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things for me there that comes out is you've got a bunch of people and it's very, very hard when you're all heading in one direction and you've just got one lone voice that's telling you something different. But it's really important to listen and consider, the outlier voices as well, because sometimes, it's quite hard to, when you're heading in one direction to actually, pick up that message. And that's what sense making, the concept of sense making is all about.
So that's goal conflict. And we talked about production versus safety and when your plans start drifting. And, I reckon if you think about your own organization, you're going to have lots of this stuff going on because it's just, what we see happening in organizations. So that goal conflict is the first major organizational learning. The second is looking at the warning signs of failure, which, as I said, is certainly a favorite of mine and Jodi's, because this is all about if you can identify, interpret, and act on warning signs, you got a chance to do something before you get a bad outcome. Now, there's 4 things we want to talk about in here. We want to talk about potential, rating potential. We want to talk about repeat events. We want to talk about critical controls. And we may, if we have some time left over, have a chat about metrics and how organizations use metrics as well. So we'll jump into potential outcome, potential consequences. Jodi, do you want to kick this one off?
Yeah, so the most obvious place to look for warning signs of failure is in the incidents that could have been much worse, but didn't result. They're almost your free kicks, and that's a great first place to look. They're your HPIs, but it's actually quite difficult to raise those to the surface. And I just want to share my screen for a minute there, Sean. Can't do it. That's okay. No worries. What I was going to show you is actually the report forms from each of the gas exceedances that came out at Grosvenor each of the times. And, you can see it's, you can picture this from the most insignificant to the most major consequence. And the major consequence is numerous permanent disabilities and multiple fatalities. Number 4 is permanent disability or single fatality. And so given what we know about gas exceedances and the deaths in the industry and the number of explosions, and you would have expected to see that on each of those report forms that people had ticked the high or the major, so that there's a potential for permanent disability at the very least.
So I've been able to share there, Jodi, so you can...
What's that?
I've been able to share my screen.
Oh,
hopefully
have you? Oh, good work.
See my screen.
Thank you. So, but as you can see, there's real confusion, and sometimes the actual consequence is insignificant, and the potential is minor, and this is a real issue with how the system works. So, if you're not identifying if you're not identifying the potential up front, then it doesn't escalate up the system. And so the bad news is not flowing up to the senior leaders. So in Anglo, if you don't tick the high or the major box, it's not classed as a HPI, which means that it's investigated within the site. You don't get an independent investigator. It doesn't get reviewed at a higher level. You don't share it with other sites, all of those kind of things that come with a high potential incident. And that's very similar in the Glencore arrangement as well.
And the board pick up on this quite a bit. There's a couple of bits about this which are really interesting. One is that the board say, how it's hard to understand how that a methane exceedance doesn't rank as a 4 or 5, given the sort of consequences it can produce, and therefore doesn't become an Anglo HPI and go up through the system to catch people's attention. But even in addition to that, I think the other bit you can see is where the circles have been used and then they've been crossed out. So there's obviously some lack of clarity at a frontline level about, well, how bad are some of these things under that potential consequence. There was one you can see in the bottom one there where it was high and it's crossed out and it's moved back down to moderate. Now, the interesting thing about this is that these still qualify as HPIs to the regulator. So suddenly you have the company producing these HPIs and doing the investigations associated with them, and they're going to the regulator. So the regulator's got visibility on them, but they are not going up through the company. So people higher up in the company can see these for what they are, which is warning signs of a potential methane incident.
Yeah, so this concept of DNRME HPI is comes out there, and it's noted on each of those forms actually that's interesting. So you're saying to the regulator, we think this is important, but you're not treating it as important within your own company, missing out on all of those processes and the opportunities to the systemic issues are the hardest ones to deal with. And so you want those things raised to the highest levels so that they can be addressed. They're obviously the ones that affect production, cost a lot of money to fix. So,
And it's important to say that, from an industry perspective, this is not just Anglo. That in part 1 of the report, finding number 63, they say that, they look at all the general HPIs, the non-Grosvenor ones. So some Anglo, some Glencore, some others as well. And there was or is it just Anglo Glencore? But they say, none of the HPIs in this chapter was classified by the mine operator or relevant parent company as a HPI, an Anglo HPI, or a HPRI. So they're just DNRME HPIs. So they're not getting escalated up. And that has a number of really pretty big consequences. The board says, in the board's view, the failure to classify methane exceedances under the risk matrix according to their true potential consequence is significant. It carries with it a substantial risk that DNRME HPIs, so they're the ones that are reported to the regulator, are seen by workers and management at the mine and at a corporate level as a subclass of high potential incident. So it's really interesting, isn't it, that the way you define how these things are reported can have a major impact on how serious people see them, take them, and manage them. And as we said earlier, because these were being reported to the regulator, they had investigations happening on them, and these investigations were good. That was one of the conclusions the board came to. The investigations were identifying the local issues that were causing the gas exceedances, and they were identifying the systemic issue that you have a gas drainage problem as well. So that, I think that's really, really important that it's picking up both of those. Another thing, just before we leave these, Jodi, is one of the things I found really interesting, which I probably let you talk to a little bit, is the concept of actual and potential. Which, okay. In terms of consequence.
We're heading in a different direction, but they're both good points. There's a really good discussion and lots of Q&A around this complexity around when you're looking at an event and you're looking at it with hindsight because it's already happened, is about how easy it is to rate the actual in terms of the controls that have failed or the ones that have succeeded. And so you end up in this situation where it's very easy to downplay the potential of something because it didn't go bad. And so anyway, I really suggest you go and have a look at the discussions in there around actual and potential. But before we do leave this topic, I want to raise one thing because it's dear to my heart, and this is around metrics. One on the safety performance scorecard for Anglo, the target for HPIs, so this is what they're trying to achieve, is 0. So if you can think about the message that sends when you've got a target of 0 you're saying to people, don't report HPIs, they are bad. And these are the things that, you have to carefully craft your systems to want to encourage the warning signs and encourage people to report. Because if it's going to affect their bonus, if they're going to feel like it's a bad thing to do, they're not going to do it if they can.
So no, absolutely. And I mean, so the key sort of message here for everyone is, if you rate the potential for high potential incidents and ordinary incidents well, you get a good chance the further up you go in the organization to have the information you need, which is the information about the really bad stuff, the stuff with a really bad potential that can flow to you that you can then manage. If that rating isn't happening because of the systems and practices or the risk competence your people have that they're able to rate it properly, then that information just simply isn't going to flow. And without that information, you're essentially blind. And what we see in this is this quite strange situation where these warning signs, these HPIs, are not escalating up through the company, but they are going to the regulator. So that's specific incidents. Let's go to the same topic for me is the concept of repeat events. So you got a situation where you got one thing going wrong and you're rating the potential of it. It just stands to sense, doesn't it, that if you have many of those things going wrong, then that's a real opportunity to say, well, what is happening here? And I think what's interesting here is that if we look at the regulator's role in this, one of the key things that the board talks about, and essentially is that it looks like that these incidents were looked at in isolation as a series of single events rather than a trend of events. And they say, whilst it is true that the immediate causes of the HPIs were unremarkable, these are the ones reported to the regulator, it does not seem to have occurred to any of the inspectors, despite the mine's history, that the HPIs were or might have been symptomatic of a greater underlying cause related to the methane management. So suddenly you move away from, yes, each of them in and of themselves are important, but put them all together and you start to get a really different and a really important picture. The key here, I think, is, make sure you've got a process in place to capture these sort of HPIs, capture these sort of events, and analyze them afterwards. That's what's really, really important. What is interesting here is this information was being captured by the regulator, but because it wasn't being seen and viewed in the right way, it was hard to see that there was some systemic issues, or there was a systemic issue beneath it, driving it forward.
Yeah, and from an Anglo perspective, it wasn't being escalated as high potential. So the pattern wasn't showing up either. And, as we saw, 14 HPIs in a really short spate of time. We might move on to critical controls, Sean.
Yep.
So most of you might be familiar with critical control management. You've got all of your suite of controls that you have in place, and there are a few select ones that are critical to the prevention of catastrophic and fatal events. And there's quite ICMM have a process. There's where you identify those. We do, and there's a decision tree flow chart where you come out the other end and you get a couple of critical ones. The witnesses said in the inquiry that, and it was over and over again, that ventilation and gas drainage were critical controls in the management of methane. Everybody, clearly agreed on that. But, the interesting thing is neither of the companies actually had identified that critical controls had failed in any of those HPIs that had occurred that the board looked at. And the thing about a methane exceedance, as we keep saying, it's a warning sign. Every time a critical control fails, this should be one of the warning signs that, that is promoted to the highest level of the business, whether it's a weakness or it fails. So whether it's a weakness in verification or whether it fails in a HPI, they deserve special attention.
And I think there's the other piece of that for me, Jodi, which we keep finding in the stuff we do, is that if gas drainage was a critical control and they were able to identify that it was a critical control, and these methane exceedants were telling them they had critical control failures, that's a very clear message if you're on the front line that this is really, really important. The other thing is, because it's probably going to be measured and it's going to go up through the organization, actually looking at key critical controls and failures of critical controls as lead indicators is going to be really, really important. So once it wasn't labeled as a critical control, not only do you lose the importance of it in people's minds, but you lose the data side of it as well that tells you that something could have been going wrong. We're very short on time, but there's just one thing I would say with the critical controls when it comes to how people do critical controls and do they do it well or not. And there's some quotes here from the board which I think are really important. And what I would say to you is have a think about your own organization. I think this will be a familiar story. The board was supplied with the critical control register for Grosvenor. The document was in the form of an Excel spreadsheet and contains a number of description columns. The register is a lengthy and unwieldy document, which is of limited use in identifying the critical controls in place in Grosvenor. I would suggest that there's probably plenty of companies out there that have the same challenge, and there's a real opportunity to do critical controls, do them well, and use them as information to when things are going wrong. So, do you want to briefly talk about metrics, Jodi? We probably could talk for a couple of minutes before we go to questions.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think there's two key things that come out of the board. The first one is process safety. The causes of process safety events, major accidents, are very, very different to the causes of personal safety. And they talk extensively and they dig into Glencore's program and Anglo's program. And, there's a real need to measure those things separately. That's probably the key message, is if you think that measuring lost time and TRIF is actually going to help you manage major accidents, that there's a very good discussion in there that shows that that's not actually the case, and that's because the causes are so different. The other thing that comes out really clearly is this measurement of lag indicators and putting bonuses on people for lag indicators. The TRIF again features really heavily in the bonus structures of both companies. I could go on all day about the TRIF, and it's a whole nother presentation, but you've got to measure the things that you want to change and that you can influence, and critical controls would be a fantastic one for companies to really start to measure in terms of failures.
Yeah. And I think we say a lot, Jodi makes that point a lot about measuring the TRIF and it's going good, it means you're keeping your process safety under control. This is a really good example of that. Measuring the TRIF really gives you no visibility on how well your gas management is working, because that's in the HPIs, and unfortunately that data wasn't flowing up through the system. So that's it. That's the warning signs of failure for us. You really should be focusing, if you want some takeaways from this to your industry, it's potential outcomes. So how well are you rating potential? What are you doing with repeat events, and do you go back and look at groups of repeat events rather than just do investigations on each of them? How are you thinking about critical controls? And we could have done a whole hour-long presentation on just critical controls, because it features really, really heavily in the Board of Inquiry. And be really careful with your metrics. If you want some really good insight into how these metrics work, there's some really good parts of this in part 1 of the document. So they are the sort of the 2 broad organizational pieces that we found: the goal conflict, which is all about the plans and the old production and safety, and your warning signs from failure.
Let's get into the Q&A. There are lots and lots of questions in here, Sean.
I was going to jump straight into one of them, which is sort of one of my favorite areas, from Grant Chisnell. And he says, is it common that cumulative risks desensitize people over time? Yes, it is. And it's called normalization of deviance. If you want to read a lot about it, Diane Vaughan, who did the investigation into the Challenger disaster, came up with it and coined the phrase. And ultimately, it's this, that the more time we spend around risks, we do become desensitized to them, we normalize them. When something happens that we treat as a warning sign and there's no bad outcome, such as a methane exceedance, for example, the more of those things that happen and no bad outcome eventuates, all the literature tells us that we as human beings, we treat that, not only that nothing bad has happened, but we treat it as evidence that nothing bad will happen. It's almost treated as proof that the bad thing won't happen. Was that happening in this situation? We don't know, because the board didn't go that deep into it. But you can imagine when you have methane exceedance after methane exceedance that that people lose their wariness of it. We certainly see it in Pike River. You certainly see that when they had their methane exceedances before they had their explosion, they were happening every day and had been completely normalized. So yeah, very real, and you got to guard against it, and you got to put in systems that guard against it, which is very important as well.
There's a great question here from Stephen Morrell. Do you think, or Morrell, I'm not sure, do you think all critical control failures should be logged as an incident? And it says, we often find people treat them as hazards, as nothing bad happened. So this is a really interesting one. The first one is, I would see an incident as a positive if nothing did bad happen. So I don't think it matters whether you log it as an incident or you have some kind of way of recognizing that failure. But both of those systems need to have equal levels of importance and escalate at the same to the same level. So whether it comes out as a hazard report, like somebody has picked it up without any incident at all, whether you picked it up in a verification, or whether it's an incident, they're all equally as important. And I think the big thing that we forget is that we need to investigate and get to the understanding of why we've had that failure or why we've had that critical control weakness. So probably the answer is no, I don't think they should all be logged as incidents.
I go on here from Michael Lewis. Was there an internal culture, with culture in inverted commas, reluctance to identify major or high events? You certainly see that reward structures are there that don't necessarily encourage, and you would say discourage, reporting. If I can pull that back out to the industry, I think there is a massive issue in the industry to not let bad news flow. And we know that if we want to improve the industry, you got to get bad news flowing from the bottom to the top in organizations, and you got to get people looking at that bad news, which is typically in the form of hazards and incidents, and then removing the hazards or managing the hazards away as part of that process. I don't think that's the way the mining industry is set up to operate at the moment. Everything I see says it's focused on, we can build a perfect system, and as long as people follow that system, it'll work and work really well. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with saying, well, why would we want to know the bad news? I think this is probably one of the single biggest areas that the Queensland mining industry can make a big difference, is to understand that bad news is generally good news, because especially if it's in the form of a HPI, because you can do something about it before someone gets hurt.
It's funny because it's so counterintuitive though, Sean. Which is, and it's everything. It's how you respond to an incident. It's how you measure things. And look, Colin Pigeon has written here, he's written to Michael, that it depends on leaders' KPIs. You get the behaviour your processes encourage. Absolutely, yeah, totally get that. There's one there from Abdullah. How much could have the use of an electronic reporting system given better insight for the board, especially when the matrix was adjusted?
You giving that one to me, Jodi?
Oh, I don't know. It's a bit of both, but I suppose underground coal doesn't typically, they still use manual forms. So I think that's where he's getting at. Would an electronic system have helped that? Probably would have covered up the confusion that you can see in the matrix with the crosses and when they're circling the consequence. But I do think, electronic systems, if they are accessible to all and well, they're broad, that they really do give you some, quicker access to the information. And if you're talking about bad news flowing up, sometimes it's good to see the high before somebody marks it off as not high.
The only thing I'd add to that is if you are going down an electronic system, which is a really good thing to do, make sure you don't lose the qualitative aspect of that system. So a lot of the electronic systems, we see people use them for counting and we want numbers going up and down. Make sure, however you set that up, that people are able to see the words behind those really, really clearly, because you need to be able to look at a trend and say, well, why would that be doing that? And so you need a really clear way of getting to the incidents or the HPIs or whatever they are and reading the detail behind those sorts of things, because that's where you'll see how well the rating is done. That's where you'll see how well the repeat events are getting picked up in your system. So really think very carefully from a qualitative point of view of how you make that work.
Yeah. Look, Deb Smythe has said here, hi Deb, if it's not a rare event, as it's not a rare event, do you think that mining organisations to some extent have an implied risk tolerance around this type of occurrence? Absolutely. And I think, it goes back to what Sean was saying around normalising the deviance. So thanks for that, Deb.
A really good one here for Andrew Rugendijk. I'm sorry, Andrew, I've probably butchered that. Does the response of the mining regulators drive the desire for zero HPIs? For example, if a mine has a period of a number of HPIs, does the mine risk being shut down by the regulator? That's a really good question. And I think that echoes a lot of concerns that mining companies have out there. Am I going to get slammed by the regulator if I report more HPIs? HPIs did have a very negative connotation associated with them until reasonably recently. The regulator is working very hard to change that view associated with them. For example, they're now going and investigating mines that have zero HPIs or have had zero HPIs for a while, because they want to understand, they understand that clearly is a reporting culture problem. And the sort of language the regulator is using now is, HPIs, we want to know, they're big learning opportunities, but they're interested in repeat HPIs and what's happening, and they're interested in if you're having repeat HPIs because you're not putting the controls you said you were going to put in place, that obviously is a different conversation as well. So it's a complicated question. I think we're trying to the industry and the regulator is trying to move on a new path with respect to these sorts of things, and it'll just take time for everyone to trust one another as that ship turns, hopefully.
Nicholas Pascoe has said he'd be really interested to hear our in-depth thoughts on KPIs and their influence on safety management. Well, yeah, it's something that we talk about lots and lots. And also there's a really good piece of work being done with QUT at the moment. So yes, there is lots to share, and it could be a future presentation.
One thing I'll just throw in here as well from very near the end, but from Gordon Walsh, that says, I think in general risk assessments are poorly understood and completed, just an observation. Yeah, I think we would probably agree with that. But it does throw up an interesting thing when we talk about rating potential. And be sure when you're rating potential, it's potential consequence. You don't let the word likelihood in there at all. We still see that in some places. And of course, the problem is if you allow both of those into a potential assessment, what you're really doing is you're taking those catastrophic events, which happen very rarely, and they immediately get downgraded in terms of their risk. So whenever you're rating potential, it's hard, and comes up on the board, make sure you stick to potential consequence and keep likelihood out of it as well.
Cool. We might wrap it up there, Sean. We do have a bunch of other questions. If you're comfortable, I think we will try and keep these things to an hour. I hope that has really sparked your curiosity about what is in the Board of Inquiry, and I think it's a great read. You know, it's worth having a look at. Don't print it though; it's 800 pages. There's my environmentally unfriendly colleague.
Fortunately, yes. Yeah, and I would just like to thank everyone for coming as well. As Jodi says, we do hope it sparks your interest to look in it. If you're not in coal, it doesn't matter. There is a huge number of learnings for anyone in an industry with respect to warning signs, production versus safety, goal conflict. There's a lot of really good learnings, and it's a big snapshot of where the industry is in Queensland at the moment. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much. See you later.